Hi, Janeites, and welcome back to the What the Austen podcast. I have an exciting episode lined up today. I am joined by author Jessica Bull to talk about her debut novel, Miss Austen Investigates. So this book's coming out on the 25th of January in the UK, so in about a week, maybe less when this episode airs. So I really enjoyed this book and I was really excited to chat to Jessica about it. A little bit about the story. So Miss Austen Investigates imagines a young Jane as observant, sharp, intelligent, and an original thinker. In other words, a perfect detective. The book sweeps us away to Regency Britain, where a body is found during a ball on a Hampshire estate. The county is in an uproar, but for a young Jane Austen, who has spent the evenings closeted in a greenhouse with a young man, the murder becomes personal when her beloved brother Georgie is accused. Driven by her independent spirit and using her powers of observation and attention to detail, Jane sets out to save her brother from the scaffold in a world where manners are more important than murder. So really excited to chat to Jessica about this today. I really enjoyed the book, really recommend picking this one up. And yeah, let's get into the episode. Welcome, Jessica. It's such a pleasure to have you on the call.
Hi, Izzy. It's so exciting to speak to my fellow Janeites. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So the question that I start all of my episodes with is, what got you into Jane Austen originally?
So I was probably the perfect age in 1995 when a certain miniseries starring Colin Firth came out. So I was about 17, I was doing my A-levels, and I was just hooked on it from the moment I first saw it. And I remember going into school the next day and disrupting my English class by talking about it so much that my teacher sent me off to the library. But he didn't tell me to read Pride and Prejudice. He told me to read Northanger Abbey, to kind of start at like what are the kind of the earliest end of Austen, because I think you've said before it's almost YA in its themes, and it's most like her juvenilia. So he said, and I think we were meant to be studying ghost stories as well, so that might have been it. So he told me to start with Northanger Abbey, so I started reading that, and then worked my way through the rest of them. And then by the time I finished Persuasion, I was actually on a kind of gap year placement, living in Hampshire, just down the road from Alton. And this was the late 90s. There was very little to do. There was no internet. There was one bus. And the one bus that I could get, I could go to Winchester, where she's buried, or I could go to Alton and walk to Chawton and visit Jane Austen's house. So, yeah, I was reading the novels and living just down the road from where she lived. And that started a love that's lasted a lifetime, really. And I just kind of, every time a new film, a new adaptation, a new book, a new biography kind of came out, I just read it and lost myself in it and always turned to Austen for comfort. And then I think when the pandemic happened, and like a lot of people, it was really tough for me and my family, I just really turned to the things that comforted me, and Austen was a big one of those. And then it got to the point where I had so many thoughts and feelings and questions about her that I needed a vehicle really to express them. So yeah, it's a lifetime love affair.
I love that. And you know what? It's not like us all, it's lifetime love, isn't it? Once you get hooks, that's kind of it for a lot of us. And then we're lifelong Janeites, which
Absolutely.
I love for us. It's our original bond, right?
Yeah, I think more than any other writer, she speaks straight to the heart, Jane Austen. I feel like, we all feel that she understands us, she sees us in a way. And I think, like a lot of people, she's been there through some difficult times, which makes that bond kind of really special.
Yes, absolutely. And because she's such a master at like capturing the human psyche, we can learn like the life lessons we're currently going through her text as well. We can be like, oh, I can so relate to this situation, or oh my gosh, I've experienced somebody like that. And it helps you to kind of work through your own life situations.
It does.
I think that's how
it really does, and encourages you to laugh at it, to not take it too seriously, to not let it bog you down, to have that like resilience that she had and that her characters always have. She always kind of picks me up and keeps me going, I think.
Yes. Oh, well, I love that so much. That's such a lovely way to come into it. And I do agree. Yeah, I think Northanger Abbey is quite a nice one to start with, because yeah, like I've said in the past, it's got that kind of YA feel to it, and also, it's got the gothic elements, which is quite fun. And I feel like if you come to it as a teenager as well, Catherine is quite relatable at that point, because you're like, oh, here's this girl who's like gets sucked into books, and just like, it's like, I understand.
She is so relatable, and her friendships are everything. And she makes so many assumptions about people, and it gets her into like so much trouble. And I think Northanger Abbey is much more like Austen's earlier works, isn't it? So it's like the burlesques that she wrote as a child. So if you start there and then you like finish at Persuasion, then
It's such
you
a
get,
journey.
yeah, you kind of go with her on her journey as a writer, and all those books are so different and reflect, how she was feeling at that time in her life, and are masterpieces in their own right for completely different reasons. So
Yeah,
yeah, I think it's a
yeah.
great one to start with.
I love that though. So it would be good to know then kind of this writing process because how the idea came about, but then also obviously because you're looking at Jane Austen and her life, that's how the book's all set. There must have been like a lot of research that went into this. So if we start with kind of how the idea came about for this particular book, and then we can chat a little bit about the researching process.
Yeah, so I was so immersed in her world, and I had read all these, you know, biographies and literary criticism, and I also went deep into the kind of Jane Austen podcast world, just how I discovered you and so many other like great kind of women usually, but like people who love her so much and have so much to say about her that you can really, with Austen, dive into some really niche areas of her life and feel connected. And I loved the way that so many people had been inspired to create their own projects through love of her. And I wanted to do something similar. So I was looking for like, what's my format? How can I do something? I'm not an academic. How can I make my tribute to Austen? And I really wanted to create a tribute that was testament to her resilience, and the fortitude that she had, because I think a lot of people, if they read her works, they confuse her with one of her characters, perhaps one of her more privileged characters, like, Emma Woodhouse, and think that it was easy for her. And I don't think it was easy for her at all. And it was knowing how hard that she had struggled to write. So when you think about all those years before she went to Chawton, where she was, she didn't have a home. She was like, she'd left Steventon. She was moving around, always at the kind of whim of others. And she had those 3 early manuscripts in her writing box, and she was really struggling to find the time, and sometimes like even brewing her own ink, sitting at that tiny little table and writing in longhand. And it was that resilience that she'd kept going through all that really inspired me to start writing again, even though I wasn't writing immediately about Austen. But at the time, I was writing a mystery, and I realized how much there was um, it, in mystery elements in Austen's work. So you think about Catherine Morland, like she even sets herself up as an amateur sleuth and accuses General Tilney of murdering his wife. And she does that because all of Austen's characters are trying to find out the true characters of those around them. You think about Lizzie Bennet when she's comparing like Wickham's side of the story to Darcy's side of the story and questioning the housekeeper. And Austen's also really, really, really interested in law and the way it discriminates against women. So you think of all that as inheritances, and the things that are morally right versus what are socially acceptable. So you think of the opening of Sense and Sensibility, where Fanny Dashwood manages to effectively steal the Dashwood sisters' inheritance just by prevailing on her husband not to impoverish their poor son. Um, and then not to mention, like Wickham running away with Lydia, and Willoughby with Eliza. So I realised there was a real link, and I love crime, and I love like P.D. James' Death Comes to Pemberley is one of my favourite all-time novels. So I thought perhaps if I took the story of her life, I might be able to convey it in the murder mystery format. So yeah, that was, and in doing that, it was an opportunity to dismiss the kind of stereotypical, oh, poor Jane, sad Jane, Jane who never married, which irritates the life out of me and probably every other Janeite who's listening. So yeah, to show off how incredibly determined and witty and irreverent and joyous she was.
I love that. Yeah. Oh gosh, something that really stood out to me as well, that you were like, you wanted to create a tribute, like something that how you could express your love of Austen. And yes, that's absolutely, I think we all find our way to do that. Like obviously me with my podcast, and there is something just so lovely, and you recognize that in other Janeites. Like I had this conversation on a recent episode actually about adaptations, and you can really sense when somebody's heart's in it, like they are a true Janeite when they create an adaptation, because you're like, you just feel it. I was like trying to explain to someone. I was like, I can't express what it is, but there's a magic there that you can recognize in other Janeites in their work alone without even chatting to them. So yeah, I love that you just
Yeah,
said that
it
then.
comes from a place of love, doesn't it? When you're just so excited and you want to you can make it different, I think. You can put your own spin on it, and everyone does. And it's lovely when people do that, to hear what they have to say about Austen, what part of her work has particularly touched or inspired them. Yeah, I love it too. I love that world
Yeah.
of people who are just so inspired that they, as you say, like start podcasts or like make costumes, organise events, and do embroidery. Yeah, the list is endless of ways to
It's
show your
just
love
so
for Jane.
much. I know. I think that's so wonderful. It'd be really good as well to chat about kind of the research inside of this, because obviously I've read this book now, and I can really tell that there must have been so much research that went into this. There was even elements of Jane Austen's life that I didn't even realize that much about, like her brother Georgie, for instance, like that he was living in like supported care, I think, in real life, but obviously he plays quite a significant part in your storyline. But there was a lot of characters in her family that I think haven't been addressed. Like, I feel like Cassandra is maybe quite well known to people who know about Jane Austen, but her brothers, for instance, more about her mum. Like, I feel like her mum doesn't come up that often. There seems to sometimes be more of an emphasis on her dad. So I'd love to know just like this journey of researching, because I'm guessing this took you a long time, because even like nuanced things, I was just like, wow, okay, that took some research.
So it was funny because it's not like I decided to write a book about Jane Austen and then did a load of research about it. I inadvertently did 25 years of research and then sat down and wrote the book. And the book then came really quickly because I think the characters and the story was informed by reading about Jane Austen's real life and the people who were important in that real life. So her mum, so the most important text to me while I was writing it were her letters. That was, the story comes directly out of her letters, as well as, the fantastic list of biographies, like Lucy Worsley and Claire Tomlin and Paula Byrne, and, all the ones that I'm sure are on every Janeite's bookshelf and they're a real treat for us to read. Um, so yeah, so I created the story out of that, and I specifically wanted to tell the stories of people who had maybe been erased or hadn't been given the place that they should have in history. So her mum, we always talk about her dad, and he was brilliant and he was so supportive. But her mum was a really great writer. She wrote these really funny poems about the neighbours, and she's got a really, really, really sharp tongue. You can see where Jane gets it from. And as for Georgie, yeah, I always felt like he'd been unfairly erased. So Georgie was the second brother and he had learning difficulties and he suffered from fits. So we can probably guess that that was epilepsy. And he didn't live with the family at Steventon Rectory. He lived with his nurse for a while and then he was cared for by another family not far away in a village. And he also lived with Mrs. Austen's younger brother Thomas Lee, so that's like Jane's uncle. So it was a kind of family setup that they had a local family who cared for both those individuals. And the traditional narrative sometimes says that he wasn't part of her life, but looking through the records really closely, I don't think that is true because there are letters from, he's not mentioned in Jane's letters, but Jane's letters are so edited, so we only have like 161 out of the 3,000 that she probably wrote during her lifetime. And he is mentioned in his mum and dad's papers. So his mum talks about her worries about his fits when he's younger and talks about him visiting, coming to stay at the rectory. And there's a really touching letter where his dad mentions him and he says, he's reflecting on his condition and he says, we have this consolation, he cannot be a bad or wicked child. And then I read about another of her relatives who's not in this book, which is Mrs. Lee Perot, who was arrested and tried for shoplifting a card of lace in Bath in 1799. And at the time, shoplifting anything over a shilling was incurred the death penalty. There were over 200 crimes in Georgian Britain which incurred the death penalty. Like everything you did, you basically get executed. But because of that, the value of the lace, it was only 60 shillings. And because of her wealth and status, she probably would have had that sentence commuted to transportation to Australia if she'd been found guilty. But she was acquitted. And it was a really awful time for the Austens. And Jane Austen's mum really did write a letter to Mrs. Lee Perret. So she was staying in the jailer's house rather than the cells because she could afford that privilege. And Jane Austen's mum really did write a letter to her offering to send Jane and Cassandra to keep her company. So there's a really family connection to that kind of injustices and the crimes of Georgian England. So I thought, with a terrible imagination of a novelist, I thought, what if I took Georgie, this most beloved and vulnerable member of the Austen family, and put him in the position that Mrs. Lee Perret was in? Would it be enough to prompt my Jane to solve her first murder mystery? Yeah.
Oh, yes. I love that. Yeah, it's like what would be her motive? What would make her, get up out of bed every morning to want to solve this? Yes, absolutely. And she's so we can tell from her text, like she is such a driven person. If it's something that she is passionate about, something that she loves, like she's going to go for it. So yeah, I love that. Absolutely. And I think it's also nice as well because, like you said, there are certain family members that you don't hear about. And I feel like Georgie's one of those ones who's kind of pushed to the side slightly. And so it's nice that he kind of gets a more prominent role in your book, even though obviously he's going through turmoil.
I know,
It's
poor
still
Georgie. I'm so mean. Yeah, but it's a story that has to, I have to make you keep reading. But yeah, I think that's one of the things when you learn about her life as well. Like, the reason that we have Jane Austen's work is really because her family was so incredibly supportive and encouraging. So I really wanted to pay tribute to those family members. Even her mum, who sometimes she can be a bit frosty with, but there was definitely like a real connection there. And of course, Henry and Cassandra, who really, supported her and managed to get her into print.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. So I know that you said obviously you use the letters quite a lot to help
Yeah,
with your writing
yeah.
process. Was that also quite restrictive and confusing at times because obviously we are missing so many letters? Was it just like there was so many blanks that you were like, gosh, I don't you've kind of got a little bit of leeway there, but also like you don't want to stray too far. So,
Yeah,
it's quite
so
difficult only having this small amount.
I think for me it was quite liberating because then I could use my imagination to fill in all the gaps, and I have changed things a little bit. So there is, like, one of her really, really early letters. Um, she talks about going to the Harwood family ball at Dean House, and so I've changed that a little bit. So they're the Harcourts in my story, and it's at Dean House, and they're those first few kind of glittering letters that describe her flirtation with Tom Lefroy. Yeah, I've put in there. But I try to make sure that if ever I'm portraying something, there is, and obviously, like, it's a modern novel, I'm gonna, do things that Jane Austen would never have done, like, having her enjoy this like secret love affair. But whatever I've done, I try to make sure that there is precedence somewhere, that I'm not straying too far from her character. So in the first letter that we've got, she describes going to this ball, and it's not just Tom Lefroy. There's a whole host of like young men that she lists, and she talks about one of them like trying to give her a kiss, and she's giving that kiss to Mary instead. So I try to, yeah, make sure that, like, even when I'm making things up, there's some kind of like grain of truth that it might reflect about her life story, and trying to use the things that happen in the novel as a kind of metaphor for the way she lived her life and the characters that interacted around her.
Yeah, I can definitely see how that would be more liberating as a writer because I feel like there's maybe more of a pressure that comes when writing if you're doing like something that's got an historical basis as opposed to, because like, I mean, this would be something interesting to talk about. Obviously, there's a lot of other writers who've done mysteries related to Jane Austen, but either using her characters or just kind of having the essence of Jane Austen's works and things. Whereas because she specifically chose to write about Jane Austen and her family, I guess that comes with its own kind of pressure and kind of this balance between what's accurate and what's, you can give a little bit creative leeway for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like, it is difficult because, like, we all have our own idea of who Austen is based on reading her works, and she really comes through. So, some people might have a completely different interpretation of Austen than I do, and in this novel. And in this novel, I'm very much looking at Jane before she was the really confident narrator of those later novels. So I'm looking at the Austen who comes through in those first few letters. She's only 19, 20, and my books are not retellings, but they're kind of shadow books. So this is my kind of tribute to Northanger Abbey in a way, because I was thinking about how Northanger Abbey is her tribute to all those Gothic novels, but she's done it something completely different. And I wanted this to be the same in that it is a tribute to an Austen novel, and I'm trying to capture her tone, and I'm trying to tell you the really like exciting and important things about her life. But it's also a Jessica Bull novel, and you know, it's I'm never going to be Austen. Like no one's ever going to be Austen. There's only one Austen, and she was brilliant. So yeah, this is Jane a little bit as Catherine Morland, like being a young woman, making those mistakes on the cusp of womanhood, learning for herself, having to confront all of her prejudices and her assumptions about the world in order to achieve what she needs to achieve.
You know, I feel like that is the most common thing that I hear when I have authors on who write texts like this, where they're always just like, I'm not Jane Austen. Like, you know, I'm not.
It's an unfair fight. Please don't compare me.
And yeah, I totally can relate. That makes so much sense. And I know you were saying that obviously everyone has their own perception of Austen, but something that really stood out to me through when I was reading like your version of Jane Austen is I love that you captured the fact, something I've always felt, is that yes, I feel like Jane Austen is a romantic, lowercase r romantic. She's just, you know, she is interested in love. She writes love stories at the end of the day. Yes, they're societal love stories, but, you know, there's love in them. But she's also pragmatic. And I love that you kind of captured that, you know, especially like in her relationship with Tom. It was like, yes, I'm having this like whirlwinds and like, yes, I'd really like him to come round and what have you. But then she also has her logical side where she can be like, what would my life actually look like with this person? Is that practical? And can I give up? Can I live in this kind of version of reality, or is that not really going to work out for me? And I've always loved that about Jane Austen. I love that you captured that in your book, because I think that's an important thing to hold to, because I feel like sometimes people can go like all on the other side and be like, oh, Jane Austen, like this massive feminist, like she was like, you know, she chose not to marry because it was like some sort of thing against men, whereas I don't actually think that is, but I think she was very good at balancing her romantic and logical side.
Yeah, I think, I really wanted to, because it wasn't a simple choice. Like for a woman of that time, you know, there's no birth control, you don't have the right to work. Like you can really, really love someone and still make a pragmatic choice not to marry. Yeah, I think that was like a really, really hard. So the way that the story plays out with Tom is obviously like fictional in my novel, but what I think I was trying to do was to talk about the way that she lived her life. I think for a long time we were sold like Jane Austen, the greatest romance writer who never found love. And I think reading between the lines of the letters, it's obvious that's not true. There's like a whole queue of men who would like to marry Jane Austen, and you know, why not? It's 200 years later and we're still all madly in love with her. But I think it's really obvious that she made some very difficult decisions to stay single, to prioritize her work, to live a comfortable life. And I think it for us, it would have been a tragedy if she married, and especially that, you know, really early love affair. Then we might have had Mrs. Tom Lefroy, but we might not know the name Jane Austen. Like her health was really delicate as well, so you know, childbearing might have been too much for her. And you know, think of how many women writers we don't have because they never made that choice. Yeah, so I think I really wanted to capture how difficult that was. And also to have Jane choosing herself be a happy ending.
Ooh, I love that. Yes. Oh my goodness. Yes, there is something really empowering about that, I think, is making the choice for yourself, you know, choosing self-concept, choosing the life you want to live, even if it doesn't match up to kind of what society's expecting of you. Yeah, sometimes the greatest love story is with yourself. What can I say? I love that so much. I also loved Henry, right? He was one of my favorite characters. So I loved him, and I loved Cousin Eliza as well. She gave me really like Mary Crawford vibes, but all of the things I love about Mary Crawford, like not Mary Crawford's kind of more negative tones, but I just loved that she was she just came across like such an empowered woman. She was very strong. She's a woman of the world. Like, she's done her thing, but she's also so graceful and elegant, and obviously knows her own mind. So she was a really great character, I thought.
Thank
Well, obviously,
you.
like, person
Sophia
slash
Eliza
character.
is an absolute legend in her own life. And again, she's like this kind of like dichotomy of womanhood because, on the one hand, she's really glamorous, she's really well traveled. She danced in the very same room as Queen Marie Antoinette, and she's beautiful and she's like obviously like really bewitching. And on the other hand, like her son, Hastings, suffered from a similar complaint as George Austen, but she chose to have him with her at all times. And reading from her letters, it's really obvious that she was absolutely devoted to that boy. Like, I'm tearing up thinking about it. And, it broke her heart when she lost him. So yeah, she's like, you can be like an amazing, glamorous like woman and who enjoys like flirtation and, the scandalous side of society. And she did. There's letters from Jane Austen's like other cousin really frowning about Eliza. It's really funny. But yeah, and you can also be a devoted mother and, those two things are
Yeah.
not mutually exclusive. And she's wonderful to explore in that sense. And I think Jane, she did live quite an isolated life socially and geographically on the one hand, but then she's also connected through people like Eliza and through her brothers who were in the Navy. She's connected to these like world events that are going on. So, and I think that's why her writing has this like enormous range and this like ability to be so universal because she had those relationships and she had those ways of tapping into what was happening in her time.
Yes, I think a lot of people touch on this, that Jane Austen by no means was oblivious to things going on in the world, and you can definitely, I feel like, of all of her text, you can see that most in Mansfield Park. Like, there's just so much in that book that just shows that she did know what was going on in all
Yeah,
kinds of different
yeah,
things. So yeah, I think
yeah,
that's important to look at for sure.
yeah.
And I love what you said as well about like Eliza. She was this kind of, she was devoted to her son, and
Mhm,
being a mom was so important to her.
mhm,
And she had like this whole life in her own right as well that
mhm.
was like separate to her family life. But I think it's nice to kind of showcase these women that did have these driving forces. For Austen, it was her work. For Eliza, it's her son, and just like making sure he
Yeah,
has the best life he can possibly have. And yeah, I think that's just like really lovely to see. And then the fact that they can come together, like
yeah.
Eliza's the one that works the most with Jane. They can come together and they're like, we need to figure this
Yeah,
out.
yeah.
So that was really good.
And everything I read about Henry Austen says he was an out and out fox. I mean, he's just, he's a legend.
Literally,
Mhm.
that was like the vibe I was getting. I thought it was so funny though, like, oh dear. Yeah, and also I think it's really interesting because you can read like people in her life and you can see elements of them in her characters, which
Yeah.
I feel like so interesting as well. And obviously, because you take inspiration from your own life, don't you? Your own society and
Mhm.
the people in your life. They're the ones that are going to inspire the characters.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and Eliza is often said to be the inspiration for Mary, but and then some people are like, no, Austen would never have pilloried her sister-in-law, and because at the time when she was writing Mansfield Park, Eliza was dying, and Austen was with her when she died. They were so close. Um, but like, I love Mary Crawford. Like, she has her flaws, but I love her. And every time I read Mansfield Park for the first half, I'm convinced she's the heroine. And then it starts to turn, and you realise that it's Fanny's story. But yeah, like, there's a lot to love, I think, about Mary Crawford.
There's a lot that I dislike about Edmund, so I actually think it's a redemption arc that she doesn't end up with.
Yeah, yeah. Who would wish for that?
No, literally, I feel like she gets a lucky escape. Really, she gets a happy ending. Mary does, which is not with so funny. I'd love to know as well, was there anyone or any topic that was particularly hard for you to research or get the information on?
So I think that probably the hardest thing was to make sure that I'd got all the details right in terms of like the legal system at the time and how that would work, and what the penalties would be, and how an investigator would go around investigating a case like this, because it's so different from the way that we think about crime and the way that we would investigate crime. So this led to some really funny conversations with my editor. So the Georgians were like very much more spiritual than us, and they didn't have any kind of idea of forensic science. So when the milliner is found murdered, we might expect everyone to kind of clear the crime scene and leave her body alone and don't change anything and look for physical clues. But they didn't really have that like approach. So what I did was I looked at real crimes and how they were investigated. And there was a really famous um, serial killing case in London in the very early 19th century called the Ratcliffe Highway murders, and how the police dealt with that. Well, they weren't police, so how the kind of authorities dealt with that is they thought that by inviting people in the area to come and view the body, they might be able to guess or kind of communicate with the corpse or the spirit of these murder victims and tell them what was going on. So
Oh my God.
it's a really awful case. So it was a young family, like a
Hey.
husband and wife and their baby who was murdered. So the police put them in their beds. So they trampled all over the crime scene, put these victims in their beds, laid them out, and literally invited everybody in the area to traipse through the house, look at the bodies, and try and guess or give some kind of indication as to what might have happened. So I then have my magistrate do something similar in terms of moving the body and inviting the whole county, and Jane goes to see the body and starts thinking, like, is this really the right way to go about investigating a murder? So that probably took the most research for me to kind of make how the crime was dealt with by the authorities as realistic as it would have been for the time, and to make that believable as well, because the first thing my editor said was like, this is wild, nobody would do this. I was like, no, really.
They would.
And then I have to
Yeah,
explain why and make it believable why.
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose something that's touched on as well is if you're a magistrate at this time period, that doesn't necessarily mean you've got any skills or experience in that area. You're
No.
just kind of picked out of society, like, you'll be good
Yeah.
for this job.
Yeah. You own like a certain amount of land, and only men can own. Mostly men can own that kind of land. Only men can really be magistrates. And yeah, it doesn't have anything to do with their legal training. It's just they're landowners, pillars of society, and therefore, well, put them in charge, and leave it to them to keep the peace. So yeah.
Yes. And I feel like and that really came through. And I think that came through in a lot of characters where there was sometimes the male characters who kind of weren't more sympathetic about the situation, and kind of they just took intuition like way out of it, and they were just doing like random stuff that they thought was right. Like I think you see that a lot with Tom as well. Like when he's talking about the situation, he does it from such a kind of logical standpoint. This is the fact, and kind of takes feeling out of it, whereas Jane balances that element of feeling and actually a practical approach.
So Tom Lefroy, was studying to be a lawyer, and obviously he goes on to be kind of Lord Chief Justice of Ireland. So yeah, he should be, in theory, the perfect person to help Jane solve this. But the law at the time was very much about property and protecting property rights. That's the whole viewpoint from which the law was written, was how can we protect property? It wasn't written, how can we protect women and vulnerable people? So that's why it's so hard to achieve justice. And I think that's something that runs through her novels. As I said, it's, people can get away with these things that we would think were crimes. So, Wickham grooming Lydia, and Willoughby effectively grooming and then impregnating and abandoning Eliza in Sense and Sensibility, and then Eliza's mum in Sense and Sensibility.
Terrible
Eliza
story.
Williams. Yeah. So she's like about 17, and she's an heiress, and Brandon's father forces her to marry his eldest son. And obviously, in marriage, all your property, your wealth is transferred away from you, so it's effectively stolen. He then abuses and then divorces her. And so she
leaves her in like a poorhouse or something. It's just
yeah,
really
well,
horrific.
the only way that she can support herself is by finding another man to act as a keeper. So yeah, I mean, these are effectively what we would consider today to be sexual crimes. And I think the genius of Austen is that she tells you all this in a very kind of light-handed way of making it part of the story, and she brings her heroines to the brink of despair and ruin, and then she pulls it back. So the heroines always get a happy ending, but in the process of doing that, I think she's made you quite angry about the way that the law treats women. And I think is that rage is really powerful, and it's a way of inspiring change.
Yes, fantastic. Absolutely. I think she has a real knack as well for, in a sense, discarding some of her female characters, that they suffer and they disappear. I
Yeah,
wrote a lot about this in the past, actually, especially female characters that you never hear anything from. You only hear about them.
yeah,
People like Mary King, who
yeah,
obviously you've got that whole
yeah,
Wickham situation. People like Anderberg, who's this sickly character that people
yeah,
only talk of. You never hear her own voice. In how a lot of women were kind of used as pawns in
yeah.
society. And I think she does touch on it, only
Mhm,
to be like, okay, we're back to our heroine story,
mhm,
but these are actual things that are going on. These
yeah,
are actual problems. I'm not going to, ram it down your throat because
yeah,
nobody wants to read that. But it's like, it makes you
yeah.
think at the same time. And you're like, that's interesting. Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's
She's
an
laying
issue.
it all out there. She's showing you exactly how the world works, and you can't help but feel, angry about that, and want things to change, and wonder what happened to those like Mary Kings, those Anderbergs, and those Elizas. You have to wonder.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, I love that so much. So I'm just like trying to. We've covered so much here. I'm loving it. Just like all over the place. So obviously you're on a bit of a mission now, because when I finished reading up the book, there was an extract for your next book. So this one's not even out yet, and the other one's on a roll. So I love that. Have you opened the floodgates? Are
Yeah,
you just
yeah,
like on the
yeah,
roll
yeah.
now?
I'm editing that at the moment. Yeah. So when I was thinking about how the series would work, there was so much that I wanted to say about Jane Austen that I kind of thought, like, how would her character develop like through a series? And as I said, like they're not retellings, but they're kind of shallow shadow books looking at the same themes. So, and I'm trying to go through them in the order that I read them, which I thought was the order that she wrote them, but I don't think it is. So the next one is kind of a shadow book to Sense and Sensibility. And I've written the first draft and I'm editing that at the moment. So yeah, I wanted to be able to like really focus on a particular instant in her life and look at the relationships around her. So this next one, Jane goes to Kent to look after Neddy, her wealthy brother's children, for the summer. So it's about her relationship with him. So when she gets there, she discovers that Mrs. Knight, Neddy's adoptive mother, has taken in a young woman who's claiming to be a foreign princess who's been kidnapped by pirates. And like
Love
held to
it.
ransom.
Classic.
And she has to then work out how she's going to stop this interloper from stealing the inheritance, which all of the Austens have come to rely on. So, Neddy's future was so bright, and now this woman is, working her way in with Mrs. Knight, and she's a big threat, and Jane has to work out what's really happening in order to save them.
Oh my goodness. How exciting. Oh my gosh. Wow. Yeah, I love that. That sounds amazing. Was the process of getting published, was that at all a difficulty? Because I know there's a lot of people listening who, are writing, and it's like, how do you get from one step to the other? What was your process like when you were transitioning to becoming published?
So it's all about persistence, I'd say. So I think I spent a long time being a bit afraid of my own ambition and kind of like writing in secret and not sharing it and yada yada. And then when the pandemic hit, I think I just kind of went to the things that brought me comfort. And I decided to really build up a network, a support network around myself. So I did lots of online courses. I made friends with lots of other writers over social media, and they've really helped and supported me. And I really educated myself about how the publishing process and the query process works through that. So definitely don't kind of like hide your light, put yourself out there, do courses, learn about the way things works. So this is by no means the first novel I've ever written. I think it's like the fourth or the fifth. And I'd queried other novels, and I knew and querying is when you have a look at which agents that you think would be great at representing you or might be interested in you, and you send out like a query letter and the first 3 chapters and a synopsis usually, which like covers the story. And I'd done that a few times before, and I'd gotten a little bit of positive feedback, or mostly just silence, which is awful. So your worst fear is that everyone's going to say no, and it's even worse when there's just nothing. So really inspired by Austen, I just kind of like kept plugging away at that and tried to enjoy the writing process itself, and write something which I enjoyed writing, which was a treat to write, which was fun to write. And then so this was like I think the third novel that I sent out, and I knew that something was different because I started to get not just silence, but kind of no, but maybe if you change this and maybe if you change that. And then I started to get people reading the whole thing. And then I knew when agents like recommend to read the whole thing, then people say that you have to contact your dream agent. So I did that, and amazingly within 24 hours she got back to me and asked to read the whole thing, and within a week she'd offered to represent me, and it was just amazing really. But yeah, it's one of those, like, it took a whole lifetime to achieve that overnight success. So just keep going is my best advice. Keep going, make friends with other writers, do writing courses, get lots of feedback on your work, give lots of feedback on other people's work, and just enjoy the actual doing of it.
Yeah, I feel like that's so amazing, because often what we only see is when people succeed and like, they're published and that's what comes out. So I love asking people this question just so people know that actually it takes time, persistence, resilience with it. Yes, it's going to be like really hard at sometimes, but if it's something you're passionate about and you love it and it's what you want to do, I think it's so worth sticking with, isn't it? So I love that. And I love that you said it was different. So you felt something different with this one and you were just loving the process. And I feel like there's so much in that as well. Sometimes it's not about sometimes like with the podcast and everything, it's not about looking at the stats or looking at like who you guys like, am I enjoying this? Does this bring me joy? Because that's the main thing,
Yeah. And when you do enjoy it, people know, when they're listening to
shines
you,
through.
and they can hear your enthusiasm, and hopefully when they're reading the book, they can see like the joy that's gone into writing it. So yeah.
Yes, no, absolutely. I love that. Well, it's been absolutely amazing to chat with you. I've loved having you on this episode. Do you want to let people know where they can find you? Obviously the book's out on the 25th of Jan. Is that just in the UK?
Yeah, so in the UK it's out on the 25th of Jan with Penguin Michael Joseph. And then in the US it's with Union Square and Co on the 27th of February. And then in Canada it's the same date with HarperCollins. And then there'll be European and other translations coming out like throughout the year as well. There will be an audiobook, and I'm so excited because the actress who we've got to read the audio is Mia McKenna Bruce, who your listeners might know as Mary Musgrove from Netflix Persuasion 2022.
So exciting. I love that. And I'm a massive on audiobooks. I love just consuming books in all forms, but yeah, I'm big on audiobooks, so that's so exciting that you're gonna have an audiobook version of this coming out.
And I am Novelist Jessica on Twitter or X, and I'm Novelist Jessica Bull on Instagram and on TikTok.
Amazing. I will tag all of your information below as well, and all updates on the book and everything, so that people can find everything easily. But yeah, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, it's such a joy to talk to you, Izzy. Thank you.